Good afternoon. Today's presentation, Protecting Your Drivers Against Today's Emerging Risks. Good afternoon. My name is Craig Dancer. I am the Transportation Industry Practice Leader for Marsh. I've spent 27 years at Marsh and have been in this particular role for approximately the last 4 years. Today, we'll be hosting this call with panelist Renata Elias, who is our Senior Consultant within Marsh Risk Consulting's Strategic Risk Consulting practice. She provides counsel and support to clients in a wide range of sectors with organizational resilience, crisis management, emergency response, crisis communications, business continuity, pandemic response planning, reputational risk, and disaster and crisis response. Renata brings to Marsh experience in both the public and private sector, including law enforcement, local government, and aviation. Rich Blazer is a fleet safety specialist team leader for Marsh's Risk Consulting Workforce Strategies practice. Rich has been with Marsh Risk Consulting for the past 22 years, where he serves as a resource to all types of fleets, ranging from large tractor-trailer to passenger vehicles. Rich and his team serve as an extension of our clients' risk management and safety departments as they strive to implement and maintain world-class safety programs. Prior to joining Marsh, Rich began his 35-year career serving as transportation industry to driver specialists in a large nationwide food distributor. Rich advanced in areas of regulatory compliance and operations prior to supporting corporate safety and risk management. As a former driver, Rich realizes the importance of training and preparing drivers to deal with evolving risks such as we all will be discussing here today. Rick Cates is our fleet safety group consultant in the Marsh Risk Consulting practice. Rick has over 45 years of fleet safety experience and was the executive director of the Safety Management Council at the American Trucking Association. Rick is a specialist in vehicle and company compliance, safety, and accountability requirements, including the FMCSA's regulation of hours of service, vehicle conditions, and drug and alcohol compliance. So thanks everybody for joining today. Today will be after our presentation, we've reserved some time for questions and answers. And as part of the registration process, we've received actually a large number of questions, which we'll be addressing at the Q&A session. But if you do have a question, there is a button at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A button. Feel free to hit that Q&A button and type in your question, and we will try to address that during our Q&A session. So thank you. So today's unprecedented environment triggered by COVID-19, I think, has really highlighted the important role that drivers play in our society. Drivers across all industries, whether they're engaged in trucking or transit operations, they're putting themselves at risk of infection in order to keep our society functioning. Drivers do represent a fairly unique operational exposure and a challenge within many organizations due to the independent and autonomous nature of the profession, particularly when you think about over-the-road trucking operations, long-haul, less-than-truckload, last-mile operations, local pickup delivery operations, transit operations, and school and campus busing. As organizations rely on these drivers to make safe and sensible decisions around safety, given the potential environmental and situational factors. However, traditional organizations, resiliency planning programs have generally focused on physical plant environments and the workforce within those environments. So in today's presentation, our panelists will spend some time discussing how should organizations incorporate drivers in preparing response plans and provide training to drivers to address emerging risk issues such as civil unrest, pandemics, natural disasters, supply chain disruptions, and cyber threats. The insurance marketplace will continue to evolve and change in response to emerging risks. And if we look at COVID-19's impact on the market, which has been widespread across multiple lines of insurance. For example, many states have made the contraction of COVID-19 compensable with very low thresholds to show that a disease was contracted while working outside the home. Many property and liability insurers are including pandemic exclusions and policies that went into effect in late March, April timeframes. And we'll likely see exclusions going forward. Because of the unknown impact in terms of the duration and financial consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic or any future pandemics, underwriters will have a challenging time to model the losses, and therefore it'll be very challenging for them to determine the premiums associated with any potential coverage that might be included in a policy. And it's also been widely publicized that cyber threats have increased dramatically due to COVID-19 crisis. and in many instances bringing businesses, including transportation providers, to a halt due to infiltrations into their IT networks. So it's important to also address coverage related to cyber threats, not only as part of our insurance program, but now it's even more important than ever that due to these changes in the insurance industry, to reassess how coverage exclusions or limitations should really impact our resiliency planning. And it's also important to note, how safety and the resilience planning play a part of your underwriting presentations as far as your underwriting submissions to insurance companies, as underwriters are now asking questions related to pandemic responses, as well as across the board response to any emergency crises. So with that, let's kick off the presentation, and I'll hand it over to Rick and Rich in our fleet safety practice, who will discuss the leading practices to help safeguard and train our drivers when faced with emerging risks. So over to you, Rich and Rick.
Thank you very much, Craig, and good day to you all. With the numerous evolving risks facing our motor carriers and their drivers today, including pandemics, natural disasters, civil unrest, nuclear verdicts, etc., it has never been more important for our drivers to integrate safe journey management into their everyday driving activities. So you ask, what is safe journey management? Well, the ANSI Z15 standard refers to safe journey management as a process in which organizations operating motor vehicles assess the use of the vehicles and all hazards and/or risks associated with the territory's travel. These risk assessments shall be utilized to prioritize and address routing and scheduling management needs. I myself consider safe journey management as a process of anticipating all potential risks a driver may face as they engage in their driving duties. This process shall prepare the drivers to avoid or minimize risk where practical, and to appropriately react to unavoidable risks as they evolve. The key to safe journey management is to expose ourselves to controlled risks versus unanticipated risks. To ultimately control risk, as an organization, we must first institute a culture where we assess the risk and recognize that risk at hand. Once recognized, we need to mitigate that risk to every degree possible. Supervisory management and driver risk assessment training are key. Reinforcing the safe journey management process is also very critical. And lastly, we must react accordingly for the risk at hand to protect ourselves and others. As one of our key risk management philosophies, a prepared and alert driver is a safe driver. Rick Cates will now be sharing with you some of the safe journey management practices which you need to engage to safeguard your drivers from the many evolving risks in today's driving environment. Rick?
Thank you, Rich. And you can see the square of safe journey management. In the first upper left-hand corner, preparedness requires the full understanding of the operation and the effects of a disaster and any emergency that you may encounter. People or departments outside your operation may not understand the impact of losses of services to your workforce as you do. If you think developing a recovery plan is somebody else's plan or somebody else's responsibility, it is not. It is our responsibility as a company and a trucking operation to share that responsibility. Mitigation involves taking steps to prevent your vulnerability to a disaster. Then, be prepared. As the Boy Scouts say, we need to be prepared for any disaster. And today, who would ever thought we would be facing the disasters and the pandemics that we are facing today? A good response in the lower left-hand corner is your ability to handle the threat of the disaster. And being prepared will enable you to handle and respond to any disaster that we may have. And then we have recover is your ability to restore the operations once the disaster is over. And all of us that can remember Katrina, going back, how we had nationwide, we had recovered from Katrina, had affected the whole trucking industry throughout the United States and the world. Next slide, Susan. You want to communicate frequently with precautionary measures to your drivers And while they're on the road, before they leave, any information that we have that we can pass along to them. Notify your drivers of hot spots, zones, or where hazards are prevalent. And that comes into good planning, and we'll get into that just a second, and provide safeguarding reminders as they're leaving, going on the road and having a good route. Provide your employees with personal protective equipment that they may need wherever they are and whatever they're doing to load, unload, freight, and personal protective equipment with the COVID-19. And the world that we lived in 3 months ago is different than the world we live in today. Provide hand sanitizer stations and anything sanitizing the trucks, vehicles, cars, fleet cars, and your personal vehicles as well. Limit personal contact between personnel, dispatchers, drivers, dock workers. Limit those personal contacts, and wear your best practices, wear your face mask. In some states, they made it mandatory. Yesterday, it came into law. And your buildings, limit visitors and guests coming into the buildings with the COVID-19, the minimal contact that we can have with people coming and going, vendors, visitors, and so forth, will limit the contact and limit our chance of getting exposed to COVID-19. And one thing, last but not least, when you're communicating with your employees, not just drivers, but your employees during a pandemic, a crisis, a hazard, you want to remain calm and reassuring. That's not the time to be excited and so forth, and good leadership to lead them through the disaster or lead them through the hazard that they're going to encounter, or if they're already encountering that hazard. Next slide, Susan. And avoid personal contact, for truck drivers and personal and surface contact when possible. Wear gloves when possible, even when refueling. Maintain a distance of at least 6 feet when possible. Limit time outside of a truck cab during fueling, loading and unloading, and any contact that you may have with those individuals. Use paperless electronic invoicing, and that is acceptable today. Even in some of the exemptions we have, paperwork is not required if you're hauling or supporting the COVID relief effort. Contact facilities in advance so that you can get in and get out with the least amount of delay and the least amount of contact with anybody at the loading dock and unloading dock. And also for long haul truck drivers, you be prepared for limited restroom usage. Most rest areas are open, but some places that you go to load and unload have facilities. They have temporary facilities, and in some places they will not allow the drivers into their location. But you want to be planned for that and find out where those locations are. Using electronic communication, and today in time, we're in that era. Use your cell phones, not while you're driving, but use your cell phones and texting and so forth, rather than going in face-to-face and having face-to-face contact. Again, pack food, water, supplies to limit the number of stops that you may have to stop along the way, and the number of stops you may not be able to get food. We may have a second wave of COVID-19, or they may be some other disasters that we may have coming into the hurricane season. You may not be able to get anything to eat, and avoid shaking hands. Nothing wrong with a good old handshake and so forth, but we live in another era, and we want to avoid doing that. Plan your route, pace to avoid hazards that a professional driver may encounter during the trip, and analyze your resources provided by new technology. Using Google Maps, Waze is a good resource, and a trucker's outlets, if available, to chart your best and safest route. And into today's world that we live in, what we're going through, we used to go with the shortest route, and the shortest route today may not be the safest route by some of the hazards that we're seeing in some of the large cities today. And first and foremost, the driver's safety is first and foremost. Take care of your driver, and the drivers driving the trucks. It's there, that we need to protect them at all costs. And we can replace the truck, but we can't replace the driver. So we want to keep them out of those hazards if at all possible. Communicate any hazards along the route or delivery point immediately to your dispatcher. And last but not least, 911, if it comes to that. And we want to communicate any hazards that you may encounter. Executing a safe trip by using all available resources and precautions at your disposal. Again, electronics, artificial technology, anything that will make our trip for our driver to keep that driver safe and protect that load. We're in business to protect that load and also protect that driver while he's out on the road. Renata.
Thank you very much, Rick. Hello, everybody. I know we've just been listening to Rich and Rick talk about driver safety, whether you're transporting, you're a bus driver in the bus driving transit business. But now I'm going to talk about overall resilience for your organization, for your company, because while it's really important to have make sure that your drivers are safe and have the programs in place for your drivers. It's really important that you have an overall plan so that you're able to respond to any type of crisis that may impact your organization. So let's talk about current state today. We're in the middle of COVID-19. We've had civil unrest. We have hurricane season. We've got wildfire season upon us. This is a time to make sure you have the plans. It's very difficult to respond to different crises at the same time. So having a plan and being prepared will really help that and really help you navigate through the response process. A crisis is a defining moment for your organization. We always say it is not the crisis or the incident itself that is going to be, you're going to be remembered for. It's going to be how you and your organization responded to that crisis. So in other words, if you think back to past crises and organizations that did not do well in response, they are now those lessons learned for all of us. Your goal when you're doing planning for your organization is making sure that you, number one, look after your people, internal and external people, which is your employees, your drivers, also your external, your customers, your vendors, your suppliers, your operations, obviously finance, but then in the end, it's all about your reputation. And if you look after your people and you look after your operations and your assets, in the end, it's going to protect your reputation. So next slide. So I love this chart, and really what it's just really trying to say is really sort of adding on to what I just talked about, is that companies that do not respond well, organizations that do not have a good response, that do not come out of it smelling like roses, have experienced, and these are public companies, have experienced a 20 to 30% drop in stock price. So that's really sort of, the impact on the financials, the impact on the brand and reputation can be long lasting. So again, it's so important to be prepared. We look at, how you managed it, how you navigated through the crisis itself. So next slide. Okay, so number one, a crisis is not business as usual. I've spoken to a lot of organizations, to senior leadership, and they've told me, hey, Renata, we work together as a senior leadership team on a day-to-day basis. So we're good. We'll be good in a crisis. No, it is not day-to-day business. A crisis brings all sorts of new dynamics to the way you have to think through and strategically think through things to be able to respond in an effective and efficient manner. So first, the biggest challenge for all organizations is 24-hour news cycle, social media. The last thing I'm sure your president or your CEO or your head of your company wants to find out about a driver that's experiencing a problem is on Twitter. So again, you want to have a process in place, a plan in place for your organization so that you do hear about things before you are told about things that coming in through the media. Confluence events. Again, we have got multiple crises on our plates right now. COVID has normally when I'm working with organizations, it's a crisis in a certain area, it's impacting a certain industry, a certain company. This COVID is impacting all of us personally and professionally. So it brings a real challenge because it's not just you who are experiencing this crisis, but we're all experiencing this crisis. But as I said earlier, we have civil unrest. We've had civil unrest. We've got hurricanes coming, storms. We've got wildfires. You may have a cyber breach on top of it. So having a plan so you're able to address the multiple types of crises that come in is really important. Understanding the problem and getting on top of the crisis before it gets on top of you. I think one of the biggest problems is that one doesn't understand the complexity of the crisis and responds too slowly, doesn't expand the response fast enough. And then the crisis gets on top of the organization. So again, having a process in place so you can go big. If you have to scale it back, you can scale it back. Get on top of that crisis before it gets on top of you. I say the same thing about media. If you don't give the media the story, they're going to give the story back to you. So again, same sort of principles. Bad timing and unpredictability. Sometimes we just don't know. Things just, did we know 6 months ago we'd be all where we are today dealing with COVID? No. So again, this is why you do not have the opportunity a lot of times to respond reactively. You want to be very proactive in your response. So to be proactive is in your planning. So to be proactive, you need to plan ahead. I have people say, well, is it too late to start planning? We don't really have a crisis management plan. We're lacking on a pandemic plan. Is it too late? No, it's not too late. It's not too late to start. It's a good chance, learning from lessons learned and what everybody's going through, to put your plans together. And then underestimating the problem, greater time restraints. That's hard. Back in the day, and I've been in this business just about 30 years, we had time to respond. But now you don't have that time anymore because there's expectations not only from your employees, your drivers, your customers, the public, general public, but there's also the social media. So you have to have plans in place so that you're able to jump into action very quickly. Next slide. Okay, this is my resilience umbrella. Normally I have one here that I can show you. But if you imagine a big golf umbrella, and I know we probably have some golfers on the call today. Imagine a big golf umbrella. The tip of the umbrella is your crisis management team, that senior leadership team. Each spoke of the umbrella represents a different component of resilience. So whether it's your emergency response plans, your crisis communications plans, business continuity plans, pandemic plans, ITDR plans, cyber plans. If you think about an umbrella that's broken, what happens when you walk outside when your umbrella is broken? You're going to get wet. Well, the same thing is with your organization umbrella. If you don't have those components in place and they're all aligned up to your crisis management team, which is your senior leadership group, they're not all aligned, there's a good chance your organization is going to get wet during a crisis. So again, making sure you have the components in place and making sure they're aligned and integrated with the crisis management team at the top, making sure your umbrella is whole. So what I ask you after this call today is go back and see if you can outline what your umbrella looks like and see if you have any gaps, identify those gaps. And it's never too late to start filling in those gaps right now. So next slide. Why we talk about resilience, and I'm going to talk about a few of the objectives. Why do we need to have a resilient organization? Why do we need to do that? And the real number one thing is your people. Your people, your employees, your drivers, including your drivers, your people at corporate. Also your people are your customers, again, your suppliers. So anybody internally, externally, your people, that should be your number one objective, to protect your people. Now there's another one, protecting in the end. I talked about brand and reputation. That in the end, if you lose your brand and you lose your reputation, that's really tough to get back. So again, you want to sort of plan ahead so that you're not going to put yourself in a position where you're having to defend your brand and reputation. Protecting your assets, obviously your drivers are important, but your trucks, and then any physical assets are really important. So again, the objectives are so important. If you understand those objectives, what your objectives are, why you need to have a resilient organization, it's really going to put you that step ahead when it comes to responding to any types of crisis. Next slide. Lessons learned. I'm a big advocate for lessons learned. I'm constantly, in 30 years, I'm constantly learning new lessons. And that is part of this, is we're learning every day on how to improve our resilience, ways of improving resilience. Every event, and COVID is a big one. There's gonna be many lessons learned from the COVID response. There's gonna be more lessons learned from the civil unrest we've been experiencing. So it doesn't matter whether it's an executive malfeasance situation, a natural disaster such as a hurricane or tornadoes, civil unrest, we're always learning from those events. And what we're doing is we're applying those learnings into our planning. So again, filling your capabilities gap. And what again I'm talking about is think back to the umbrella. Look at your umbrella, your organization's umbrella, and see if you need it, if there are any gaps that need filling. Because again, you want that whole umbrella in the case you get nailed with a heavy rain crisis storm. You want to be proactive, and I've said that already. I can't say enough about being proactive versus reactive. COVID has been a little bit different. It's in a way, a lot of people have been reactionary with COVID because it's something we've never experienced before as far as a disease. However, pandemic planning has been around. So making sure you have a pandemic or communicable diseases plan is really critical. So understanding what your roles are, defined roles in your organization. So for example, the president of your company should not be running into the building, putting out the fire. That should be your emergency response team, who are the tactical operational going to put out the fire. Just like those in the emergency response team or the fire wardens within your office building for your corporate, they shouldn't be in the boardroom making those strategic decisions about your company's overall operations. So understanding those roles and responsibilities really helps with a well-organized response. And again, being forecasting, getting on top of things, anticipating, and being swift in your response. Unfortunately, we don't have, as I said, we don't have as much time to think about it. We need to have the plans in place. We need to have trained and practiced on it so that you're able to jump in with confidence and in response. So next slide. Little bit, I'm going to keep this very high level. I believe you'll get a copy of this presentation. These are some of the strategic framework around crisis management. So again, I'm focusing on that tip of that umbrella, that senior leadership team, your executive team. But these are the things to remember, is that a crisis management is not, you don't have a crisis management plan for 10 different risks. You have one crisis management plan, one process that can respond to all risks that you may encounter. Again, it could be natural disasters, it could be executive malfeasance, it could be a cyber breach, it could be a civil unrest situation, it could be a pandemic. It gives you that framework. It provides you with that process so that you're able to respond. Your senior leadership is able to respond to any type of crisis. It provides that 360-degree view of your organization and your crisis. So it's really important, you know, when you're looking at a crisis management process, that you understand what your range of risks are. You have that one process for your team that you train and exercise. And the best practices is that your senior leadership should be around, huddled around a table once a year at least, talking about the scenarios that may impact your organization, and walk through how they would respond from that senior leadership level using a crisis management process. So next slide. Love General Eisenhower's plans are worth this, but planning is everything. So again, your plan should, even if it's, you've got your plan completed, sitting in the cloud, or it's still on a binder on the bookshelf, that's not it. It's bigger than that, and it's making sure you update those plans, but then you also make sure your people are trained. You do those exercises. Tabletops are the best ones. I highly recommend tabletops. And then you also spread information out to your employees, your drivers. Make sure that they are aware of what your organization, your company's response to a crisis is. Next slide. So a couple more just to finish this off. And this is something you'll be able to take afterwards. This graph I really like because it sort of shows you the 5 levels of maturity. So again, you looked at your umbrella that I talked about. We got some pieces missing. You can then look at this chart and really sort of see where you sit as an organization as far as your level of resilience maturity. What I'm seeing is a lot of companies, organizations are between formalized and established. Obviously, the goal is you work your way up to optimized. So, you know, when you get this after the fact, look and see where you are and really look at aiming, you know, increase and enhancing your program, updating your plans, filling in those gaps so that you're able to get to an embedded or an optimized level of maturity. And next slide. And to help you out with that, because I wouldn't leave you hanging like that, if you need that help or you need that guidance on how to put a program together, here's a 4-step phase approach that we use. We recommend whether you do it in-house or you get an outside third-party consultant to come in and support you to do it. But look at the 4-phase approach to developing your plans, then doing the training and exercise, and then integrating the plans out to your people. So I think this is a very helpful 4-step approach for that. And next slide. And I'm, obviously, as you can tell, I'm all about quotes. Love Stephen King. Wrong is royal. There's no harm in hoping for the best as long as you're prepared for the worst. And with that, to that end, I will pass it back over.
Great.
Craig, if you don't mind if I say a few words here in closing. The Stephen King slide, if you could go back to that, please. We talked about safe journey management early on, and it's up to us as managers and supervisors really to help our drivers with putting together a plan, but we also really need to help them with understanding the power of visualizing their route, visualizing their trip for that day, and being able to visualize the potential hazards they have, because ultimately what they're doing is they're preparing for the worst. And if those risks don't develop, so be it. It's all the more power to them. That means their plan paid off. So really that safe journey management comes down to exactly what Stephen King is saying, that we need to prepare for the worst by being prepared to react to situations, whether it be civil unrest or protests or a tornado or a wildfire or any of those other evolving risks that we have to face on a daily basis while we're out there driving. So being prepared for the worst allows us to react accordingly and really be safe. So again, an alert and a prepared driver is a safe driver. Back to you.
Thanks a lot, Rich. I actually thought when you wanted to go back to the last slide, you were going to be commenting on how Stephen King has aged. Of course, I still remember him from like when he wrote The Stand and those novels. So anyway, but it's all good. No, Rich, that was good parting advice there. So we're going to move on to the Q&A session. And as I mentioned in the opening, there's a button at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. Feel free to go ahead and click that and post your question, and that will come through to the panel here. And there was a question earlier as far as just some logistics. The slide deck will be provided to all the panelists. So, you know, I guess at some point once we've concluded the meeting, there will be an email that will be sent out to everybody who is registered for today's presentation. So we'll start the Q&A session here. Maybe we'll open it up to both Rick and Rich and Renata. You know, I think the news, and we talked about it, you know, briefly in some of the prepared comments, but obviously, you know, we are still seeing, you know, even till last night, continued civil unrest. And I think, you know, as we think about sort of the driver and that person, as I noted, being sort of in an autonomous and independent state, you know, they're alone in that vehicle, or if it's a transit operation, you know, they're alone, but they have passengers on the vehicle. So how do we really prepare somebody, you know, whether it's a civil unrest situation like that scene that we all saw in Minneapolis a few weeks ago when that tank truck drove up on the bridge? I mean, how do we help drivers sort of keep themselves calm and keep themselves safe in those situations, as well as you know, trying to, if there's any way to diffuse a situation. So maybe Rich, do you want to lead that question?
I'd be happy to, Craig. It really starts with us as an organization and our organizations. We as managers and supervisors need to actually talk to our drivers about what do you do in that situation. It's no different than a collision. None of our drivers, hopefully our drivers don't have a lot of collisions. So they're not very experienced collision managers. And with that in mind, same thing with civil unrest. When they approach these civil unrests and they get involved with them, they need to have a plan in place. They need to know how to react to first and foremost protect themselves, but then secondly to protect the general public and all beings. So I guess simple things is sitting them down and saying, folks, first and foremost, don't fuel the fire. Stay calm, stay in your vehicle as long as possible. If anything else, avoid it if you can. And that's the number one part of that safe journey management, is to identify where those hot spots are and try to avoid those hot spots. But if you do come across that, to stay calm first and foremost, to be prepared to look for an out, look for that the safe haven for yourself. Don't confront others, and by no means don't instigate the situation. Try to diffuse the situation. Try to secure your vehicle if at all possible. If you have to leave your vehicle, make sure you take those keys with you. Don't let that vehicle there to become a weapon of some sort. And of course, blend in with the crowd then and look for the authorities, look for some kind of safe haven. But at the end of the day, we have to have a plan in place, and we have to talk to our drivers about what happens in that situation, because it's so prevalent out there today, and our drivers are going into some real hot spots out there, and we just want to make sure that they're safe.
Rick, do you want to comment on anything as far as maybe not just civil unrest, but obviously, Renato mentioned that we're also entering hurricane season, fire season. It's, when you think about even flash flooding, obviously, folks out in the West, they're prevalent to flash floods. I mean, what should we really be preparing ourselves for? What kind of training should we be looking at from that regard?
And then Rich hit on it, safe journey management, planning, just like a pilot would, planning a trip, is going to fly across the country. They look at the weather, look at anything that may disrupt that trip, look at the news and stay on top of anything that along the driver's route that may hinder that driver from completing that trip. And you're exactly right. And sometimes, in some cases, a stream or a small river may flood, and that driver may not know that, but also using Waze and staying in contact with dispatch and operations and other drivers in law enforcement helps us to avoid those areas. And if we know that there is a problem in an area that we usually go through, then as I said a while ago, sometimes the shortest route may not be the safest route. So we may have to take an alternative route until the threat goes away.
And Rick, this is a question, and it's probably a sensitive question, so I'll be delicate about it, but we did have one of our participants, a couple of them actually asked the question about, well, should we be arming our drivers?
But no, drivers are not trained to use a firearm in that sense. There are so many local municipalities, large municipalities that have ordinances that do not allow firearms in their municipalities, in their city limits and so forth. And in some cities, it's a federal crime to have a firearm within the city limits. And it is not recommended under any circumstance unless it's a armored car or a DOD. If you're having a DOD shipment, then those drivers would be trained in how to use that. But no, absolutely no, it is not recommended for anybody to carry a firearm, even though they got a concealed carry. They are not trained in that situation, as Rich said a while ago.
Good way. So Renata, from the corporate angle on this, I get you probably have some pretty, with the confluence of, civil unrest, COVID, hurricanes, wildfires. I mean, it seems like we're just entering a pretty, well, not entering, we've been in a pretty unstable time, and it doesn't seem like, with sort of the seasons that are coming up and, wildfires in the West, hurricanes in the South. I mean, everybody's going to be on edge, I would imagine, in the next, 4 or 5 months. And then you're now hearing with, hot spots of COVID reemerging in Texas, California, South North Carolina. So I mean, what should we be doubling down on in terms of corporate resiliency here?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. And I'm in Dallas, and so I'm feeling the spike right now. I think organizations just really need to, as I said, it's not too late. Even though it may seem daunting right now, it's definitely not too late to plan. And number one, plan, but also make sure that your people are safe. Making sure your people have the right information is really important. It's also not too late to analyze, look back at how your response to COVID, and if you were impacted by the civil unrest, how that has gone, to look back through a post-incident debrief, even though we're not technically post-incident, let's kind of take a pause, look back at how your response went, and identify the areas that worked well, that areas that need improvement, and then start plugging those holes now moving forward. Because yes, it looks like COVID is going to be with us for a while, whether we're still in phase of wave 1 or we're moving into wave 2. And then plus with the other hurricanes, wildfires, plus winter storm season coming up in the fall. I think this is an opportunity for organizations to look at, how you've done already, and then plug those holes moving forward. Also, making sure you push your information out to your drivers is really important to make sure that, I always say you're only as strong as your employees are, as much information as they have. That's how strong you're going to be. You can't keep it all at corporate. Make sure you share that information out.
Excellent. And with with the recent reemergence, we're starting to see, and Rick, you touched on this. Some of the states, and I know, I live in Virginia. We've got a mandatory face mask law here in Virginia. But this ties into one of the questions, and I know a lot of changes, from the CDC have come out as far as COVID situation, but in terms of the schools, and those that are in the public transit arena, corporate shuttles, school shuttles, buses, etc. How does social distancing work in that regard? I mean, if you've got a school bus, and I know schools have to determine whether they're going to go back to school or not, but for any vehicle that's going to have multiple occupants, and how does that whole social distancing work, and what should be the protocols relative to sanitizing that vehicle in between rides, that sort of thing? And you're on mute, Rick.
All right. A good example is the subways and the metro in the DC area and the at Puget Sound and a lot of the metro areas, mass transit. They are using social distancing. They're allowing but so many passengers on each car, each bus. And at the end of the day, or if they have a passenger that disembarks on a bus on mass transit, they would go back and disinfect that seat and wipe down the handholds overhead and the ones on the side. Same way with the 15-passenger van. The world we used to live in is different. Now, if it's private, that's one thing, but if you're operating a transit company, that's another. You have to disinfect and have to use social distancing and follow the CDC guidelines when you're transporting passengers and so forth.
Yeah, and I would add on to that too. I mean, we touched on, I touched on insurance sort of at the beginning of the discussion, and I think this is also an important time to really just figure out, from a protocol standpoint, because when you think about, anyone in the public transit sector that's not the public entity itself, but is a private enterprise providing is supplying transportation services to, whether it's a school or whether it's a university or in the public transit space. Prior to March, I mean, there was really nothing in liability policies, whether it was your auto liability or general liability policy, that really addressed any sort of pandemic from a coverage standpoint. I mean, it was essentially silent, no exclusions. Since mid-March, when we started going into these lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, the insurance world really changed in terms of almost on a dime in terms of liability coverage. And you started seeing exclusions added to policies. And again, they're very, very challenging. I think, from a driving perspective, in terms of the auto liability coverage, carriers were willing to, agree that, if a driver got into if a driver fell ill and during, during a driving operation fell ill and, and got themselves into an accident, the intent was obviously not to exclude coverage on that basis. But I think what we're seeing now is, particularly those that are transporting people as opposed to just, freight, you are going to see challenges in the context of providing, any kind of coverage. I think the underwriting community has taken the position that if I'm moving people around and there's and subsequently get, diagnosed with COVID symptoms and have to self quarantine, they're out of work, they can't work, or they can't get on workers' comp, et cetera, and they try to turn around and sue the entity that was providing those transportation services. An underwriter, even for on a defense cost basis, is going to have a very hard time trying to quantify that risk. So, when the insurance industry has no ability to quantify the risk, their first instinct is to exclude the coverage entirely. And that's sort of where we are today. And I know, Marsh on other calls has, we're in the process of supporting and working with Congress to pass a PREA bill. But until such time as there is a solution, and it likely will have to be a government-supported solution, I think it's important that you follow every protocol possible, because at the end of the day, if you're not going to have an ability to provide, some sort of insurance company, or even have the insurance company provide you with a defense, your best measure is going to be following every single protocol that's laid out, whether it's by the CDC or otherwise, in terms of sanitation and social distancing. So, so with that, keeping that sort of in mind, Renata, as far as this whole issue with, how does one deal with, specific issues such as a pandemic? Resiliency plans, they're probably very good at dealing with more of the public hazards, the traditional hazards. So what are maybe some of the core elements from a pandemic perspective that companies should be thinking about?
From a pandemic planning?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Craig. Good question. I think, I think an ideal plan, and having put together many of these plans, is, and really sort of, this is a good time to use the information that you've already put together. But looking at a before, during, and after sort of format for a plan. So before, sort of, do you have a pandemic working group, which is recommended and is a great idea, is that your organization, your company has a pandemic working group comprised of key functions that are impacted and would have a play in a pandemic response. Looking at, what are the things you need to do? So back in January, February, when we first heard about the COVID-19, what are some of the things that you can do before as an organization? Start preparing your employees, start talking about some of the, the cough, cover and cough, those different procedures, sanitizing, washing hands, all those things. Going then flipping over into a response phase of your pandemic plan. Now that the pandemic's hit, we've got the different levels of the response from and following the CDC, outlining what your protocols and procedures are for that. And then for the after, or the returning to the workplace or returning to driving, so what does those procedures look like? That is what I see as kind of the best framework for a pandemic plan. Also, keeping in mind and making sure that your continuity plans, and this is huge for pandemic, is your business continuity plans, that they're up to date, that you're able to, for corporate, and obviously these drivers is slightly different, but for your corporate staff, you're identifying those that can work remote versus those that can't. What are your critical functions? What are your critical applications? So looking at those type of things as well in conjunction to your pandemic plan, I think are really important.
And that's, that leads into, actually, that's a perfect segue, not segue, but it actually is, it's a corollary to a question that we just received. And it gets perhaps a little more granular, and we'll open it to you, Renata, to start, and then Rich and Rick, if you can comment in terms of as a manager, somebody who's got I've got 1,000 responsibilities I got to take care of on a day-to-day basis. How do I get somebody to really focus on risk planning? When I've got 10 other things on my desk that I have to take care of immediately. So maybe Renata, if you could just sort of address it more in a corporate sense, and then maybe Rick or Rich, if you want to chime in on, whether it's the driver manager or whether it's the traffic manager, et cetera, that how would they go about, again, getting a driver to focus on those responsibilities and make them a little more aware of that?
Thank you. Well, that's a great question. It sometimes can be a tough one to answer because I don't know if there's any great answer to it. I think the most important thing to know is obviously you need somebody, whoever's going to be doing this function of planning, it needs to obviously really be passionate about it. I've done it all my life, both in private and public sector prior to Marsh. You have to be passionate about it. But it's really important, I think, to get your buy-in from your president, your CEO, your leader of your organization or company. Once that they have said, this is important to our company, we need to and we must do it, that will also help you push and get your employees motivated to do it. I think if it comes from above, that this is going to be what our company is going to do, this is important to our company for our people, our operations, our reputation and brand, ultimately, that comes from the leader, then I think it will make it much easier for you to gain that buy-in from your employees who are tasked to do this. So I think that would be the best piece of advice I would have.
Craig, it's interesting you asked that question. I had worked with a client most recently, and they gave me a virtual tour of their driver manager floor. And on their driver manager floor, they had all the walls projected with different screens where their vehicles were, where they're going, where their core customers were. And then, of course, they had the projection of the weather. So they had U.S. satellite with the weather channels, satellite weather to show where storms were evolving. The tropical storm that just was down the south that came on board in Louisiana most recently was showing at that time. It was during that time that we were actually looking at it. Well, I asked the question of, well, who's putting all this stuff together for the driver managers to use to communicate out to the drivers? And they said, well, we actually developed a new position, and that new position is called the journey manager. And that journey manager is in charge of weather, hot spots for civil unrest. They're in charge of wildfires. They're in charge of keeping their eyes and ears open as to some of the hazards our drivers are going to face. And thus, it's up to them to communicate it to the fleet managers, who ensuingly take that information and communicate that out to their drivers as they manage their drivers. So really, that dispatch floor plays such a key role in communicating the drivers. And I was so impressed, but I left that with that whole safe journey management process and the fact that a journey manager is really a true position within an organization.
Yeah, that actually is pretty impressive, particularly given the current situation. And I guess, Rich, for those companies that don't have sort of that journey manager, and again, this sort of addresses some of the questions that we got as part of the registration. To what extent? I mean, I assume we really should be including some specialized training for our dispatchers and driver managers. When a driver calls up and says, "Hey, I'm stuck in the middle of a wildfire, or there's a hurricane coming, or there's a riot going on." I mean, so how do we what's the best way to sort of communicate back to drivers as far as what we do or what they should do in that situation?
Well, Craig, I think that's a great question. I think to answer that, first and foremost, we have to have that plan. We need to be thoughtful of what kind of hazards can our drivers experience, and be prepared to put that plan in place. I like your comment of driver manager, and I say this over and over. That person who is actually dispatching that driver should be a driver manager, not a dispatcher. A dispatcher controls the load. The driver manager controls the person. And we're all about controlling the person that's behind the wheel of that vehicle, because they ultimately are controlling that load. So giving them the recipe for success, the guidance they need to carry out that safely is so important. So really, the education goes beyond just that driver. It goes into the fleet manager side or the driver manager side to make sure that they understand their role is the total support of that driver, not just to get the load from point A to point B.
That's a great point, Rich. Hey, Renato, we got a question that came out over the Q&A here. It asks, does Renata have a sample pandemic plan we could see? So I'm sure you probably get that quite a bit.
A lot. Thank you. Good question. What I would recommend is the Marsh Return to Workplace Guide playbook that we've released, and we can always make that available, I think. So I'll confirm with that. And that playbook will include a lot of the components that you need for your pandemic plan, including how to put your pandemic work group together, how you deal with, how you put together your policies, etc. So I would recommend that, as well as CDC has some great guidance for planning for businesses. So between the two, our Marsh workbook and the CDC guidance, that should give you all the answers to putting a plan together. But if you have any further questions, please feel free to email and we can discuss.
Okay, great. Yeah, we'll get a link out to that document as part of the when we release the slides. Hey, real quick, Rick, we've only got a few minutes left here. Obviously, we can't talk about transportation and not talk about regulation, right? So, a lot of questions, trying to consolidate into one, but we've between COVID and civil unrest and emergency orders passed by the DOT. I mean, what should we be expecting? In terms of what do we do in the event of an accident? I mean, will police show up to do an accident report? Are we going to still be doing roadside inspections? CDLs, med certs, all hours of service. A lot of that stuff, is all being wrapped up, whether it's in COVID or when hurricane season starts and snow season starts, floods. So maybe give us a little bit on that, if you could.
Yeah, they have started roadside inspections on a limited basis. They have started going back, and the scales are back open, and they're having limited level 1 inspections. Most of level 3s walk around. And of course, if you have you can see the signs on the interstate and so forth. If you have a crash, somebody bumps into you, or it's a little more serious, follow the protocol from your company, and also follow the protocol from your company and call 911 and follow their protocol, what they tell you to do, if you're on the roadside. And also regulations, hours of service. We've got the exemptions in place. And if you run up on some of those hazards, civil unrest or pandemic where you can't get through, use the COVID exemption.
All right, Renato, we got 2 minutes. Can you maybe give us a little bit more? So you put together, part of the Return to Work book. So do you want to just give a couple highlights, and then we can obviously just we can send people to the link for more detail?
The book has just got some great valuable information. It's got everything from how you started and step-to-step guidance onto how you put get your return to work plan together, as I said, including putting together your group, how you do. There's various different tabs in the playbook that also gives you guidance on everything from policies, temperature checking, I know I'm running out of time here. After action reviews, all of that. So it's a really great, valuable document. I encourage you to look at it. And then if you have any questions, you can reach out to anybody after the fact.
Terrific. Well, I just want to thank everybody for their time today. Hopefully you found some good value in our discussion here with the panel. And I hope everybody has a good safe rest of the summertime. And let's keep thinking positively that we're going to get all through this. So again, thanks everybody for your time today. Appreciate it. See you later.